9,400,000 square kilometers. That's the area of the Sahara. To give you a sense of that number, it's larger than all of Brazil, larger than all of Australia. One desert, bigger than entire continents on the map. It stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, across 11 countries in North Africa, nearly 4,800 kilometers from west to east. And most people think they know everything about it. Hot, sand, camels, mirages. But what's really happening in this territory defies all expectations, because the Sahara isn't a dead zone. It's a mechanism that sustains life on the other side of the planet. And now I'll explain how it works. The first misconception is that the Sahara is made up of sand dunes. Postcards and movies have done their part. In reality, those golden waves of sand cover less than a quarter of the entire area. The rest consists of rocky plateaus, gravel plains, salt flats, dried riverbeds, and mountain ranges that few expect to find in a desert. In southern Algeria, the Ahaggar Highlands rise, with peaks exceeding 2,900 meters. These are serious mountains, covered in dark basalt cliffs, with gorges and canyons where it sometimes rains and wild olives grow. And in Chad stands the Tibesti Highlands, home to the Imikusi volcano, 3,415 meters high, the highest point in the entire Sahara. A volcano with a caldera 13 kilometers wide at its summit, and the local Tubu people know it better than any geologist. When people say desert, they picture a flat expanse, but the Sahara is a landscape with elevation changes of over 3 kilometers. The second misconception is that it's just hot here. No, there's a temperature nightmare happening that no other place on Earth can compare to. The highest air temperature ever recorded on Earth was in the Libyan city of El Azizia, 58 degrees in the shade. That record was later disputed, with meteorologists questioning the accuracy of the equipment. But even if we take the confirmed record from Death Valley, 56.7 degrees, that's a temperature at which metal surfaces can burn skin instantly, asphalt melts, and the human body begins to fail within mere minutes without shelter. But here's what really blows your mind. At night in winter on the Tibesti Plateau, temperatures drop to -10. During the day, +45 at night, -10. The daily temperature swing can exceed 50 degrees. And this swing isn't just uncomfortable, it acts like a weapon of mass destruction for rocks. There's a process that geologists call thermal weathering. During the day, the rock heats up and expands. Then at night it cools sharply and contracts, over and over, day after day, year after year. And at some point, the rock simply fractures. Without water, without wind, without earthquakes, the rock tears itself apart because it can't withstand the temperature difference. This process has created those very stone screes and gravel wastelands that occupy a huge part of the Sahara. The desert literally grinds itself down. Now, why is it so dry here? The answer isn't in the sand or the sun. The answer lies in the atmosphere, high above. The Sahara is located precisely in the zone of the subtropical high-pressure belt, and this is where something meteorologists call the Hadley cell begins. The concept is simple. Hot, moist air rises over the equator, loses moisture in the form of tropical rains, and then, already dried out, spreads north and south. Above the Sahara, this dry air descends, presses down on the surface, and literally prevents clouds from forming. It's like a lid on a pot, but in reverse. The lid doesn't keep moisture inside, it keeps it out. The air descends, heats up through compression, and becomes even drier. And it goes on in a cycle. This mechanism has been working for millions of years, which is why the Sahara isn't an accident, but a predictable result of how the Earth's atmosphere is structured. We need to pause and fix one thought that will be important later. The Sahara isn't a broken piece of the planet that needs fixing. It's a functioning element of the global climate machine. It doesn't just exist, It performs specific functions without which life in other parts of the Earth would be completely different. What those functions are, I'll get to that later, and it'll be the most surprising part. But for now, let's talk about those who live here. Because in these conditions, with such temperatures, such a lack of water, and the temperature swings that fracture rocks, organisms live in the Sahara. And they don't just survive, they function as part of the system. Each of them is an engineering solution honed by millions of years of selection to absurd efficiency. Beetles that drink mist, antelopes that never approach water in their lives, scorpions that can go months without eating, cheetahs so rare that their existence is in question, and each of them has its place in the chain. And if you remove one, everything starts to crumble. This isn't a figure of speech. It's a specific ecological mechanism, and I'll break it down link by link. Because the story of the Sahara isn't just a story about heat and sand. It's a story about how the most hostile place on Earth turned out to be one of the most important, and about how we, humans, managed to break even what has worked for millions of years without our involvement. The Sahara is the planet's heat engine. It pumps air, it moves dust thousands of kilometers, it influences currents in the Atlantic and monsoons in India. It's connected to the Amazon, to the Caribbean Sea, to the water temperature off the coast of Florida. One desert and half of planetary processes are tied to it. And to understand how this works, we first need to descend to ground level, to the level of a beetle the size of a fingernail, which at dawn raises its rear into the wind to catch a drop of water from the mist. Because it's from this beetle that the chain begins, which ultimately feeds the tropical forest on the other side of the ocean. It sounds crazy, but it's pure science. And every step of this chain is verified, measured, and documented by satellites, expeditions, and laboratories around the world. And here's something else to keep in mind as we move forward. People tend to divide the world into useful and useless. Forests are useful, they provide oxygen. Oceans are useful, they have fish. And deserts are empty places that should be planted with trees or covered with solar panels. This logic seems sound until you start to dig into the details. Because the Sahara, in its current form, dry, scorching, almost lifeless at first glance, does things for the planet that no forest can replicate. It moves minerals across the ocean. It initiates wind currents that determine the weather on 3 continents. It acts as a giant reflector, influencing the energy balance of the entire atmosphere. And within it, on the surface and beneath it, there exists a network of living organisms that holds the entire structure from ultimate collapse. These organisms don't fight the desert. They are part of it. They're embedded in it, like gears in a machine. Remove one gear, and the next one stops turning, and then the third one stops. In the next part, we'll dive down to this level and examine specific species that hold the system together. We'll start with the beetle that engineers around the world are trying to replicate. We'll continue with the antelope that has never drunk water in its life. And we'll finish with the dung beetle, without which the soil of the Sahara would turn into completely sterile powder. In the previous part, I said that the Sahara is a mechanism, not an empty space. Now it's time to descend to ground level and break down the specific details of this mechanism. 3 species, 3 levels of one system, a beetle that collects water from the air, an antelope that has never approached a water source in its entire life, and a dung beetle, without which the sands of the Sahara wouldn't contain a single nutrient. If this seems trivial, wait until the end, because without these 3, everything I'll be discussing next simply wouldn't exist. Let's start with the darkling beetle. This small black insect from the Tenebrionidae family is about the size of a fingertip. Nothing impressive at first glance. But engineers from MIT, Oxford, and dozens of laboratories around the world have been studying this beetle for over 20 years and still can't fully replicate what it does every morning. Here's what it does. At dawn, when a faint mist sometimes reaches the desert outskirts from the ocean, the beetle climbs to the crest of a dune, turns its back to the wind, and raises its rear end. It just stands there and waits. During this time, microscopic droplets of water from the mist settle on its shell and begin to trickle down, right to its mouth parts. The beetle drinks the mist. This process is called fog basking, and it works thanks to the surface structure of its elytra. There are two types of areas alternating there. Tiny bumps that attract water and depressions between them that repel it. A droplet lands on a bump, grows, and when it becomes heavy enough, it rolls down the water-repellent groove to the beetle's head. This is pure nanotechnology, but it wasn't invented in a lab. Evolution developed it over millions of years. And here's the important part. This isn't just a neat trick for a documentary. This structure is already being copied. There are prototypes of fog nets designed based on the darkling beetle's shell, and they're being tested in Chile, Morocco, and Namibia, everywhere people lack fresh water but have fog. The beetle from the Sahara could be the key to water supply in arid regions around the globe. Meanwhile, it also performs another job. It processes dead plants and organic waste, serving as food for lizards, small birds, and other predators. Darkling beetles are the foundation of the food chain for small desert fauna, the bedrock upon which everything else stands. Now, let's move up a level. The Addax antelope. If you haven't heard of it, that's okay, because the Addax is in such a state that soon there may be nothing left to hear about. In the wild, there are only between 30 and 100 individuals left. 30 to 100 for the entire planet. They inhabit remote areas of Niger and Chad, and their numbers decrease every year. But while they exist, it's worth understanding what this creature is, because the Addax is probably the most perfectly adapted, large desert mammal that has ever walked the earth. An adult male weighs up to 135 kilograms, has spiral horns that can reach up to 109 centimeters, and lives in conditions where most animals of its size would perish within a day. The first trick, its fur. In summer, it turns almost white, reflecting up to 60% of solar radiation. In winter, it darkens to gray-brown to absorb heat. The Addax itself switches its thermal regulation depending on the season, and it doesn't need any technology for this, just a genetic program honed over millennia. The second trick, thermoregulation. The Addax body can heat up to 6 degrees above normal without triggering cooling. 6 degrees, that's a huge buffer. Any other large mammal would start actively evaporating water through breathing and sweating at such a temperature increase, losing precious moisture. The Addax endures. Only when its body temperature exceeds this threshold does it begin to shed heat through specialized nasal breathing. It pushes air through a complex system of nasal passages, where the blood cools before reaching the brain. The third trick, and this is perhaps the most astonishing, the Addax doesn't drink water at all. It gets all the moisture it needs from the plants it eats, and from the morning dew on them. Its kidneys operate at the biological limit, producing extremely concentrated urine to avoid losing a single drop of excess liquid. Its droppings come out almost completely dry. This animal is so adapted to life without water that the presence of a water source isn't a factor in its territory selection. It goes where there's any vegetation, and that's enough. The Addax has wide, flat hooves. They act like snowshoes, preventing the animal from sinking into loose sand. It travels hundreds of kilometers across the dunes in search of fresh greenery after rare rains, using minimal energy thanks to its perfectly adapted anatomy. And this biological masterpiece is nearly extinct, hunting with automatic weapons from jeeps, military conflicts in their habitats, loss of grazing lands. Reintroduction programs in the Entity Reserve in Chad are trying to return Addaxes to the wild from zoo populations, and there are some successes, but the scale of the catastrophe is such that we're literally talking about saving the species. Now, the third level, which is, frankly, the most underrated. The dung beetles of the Sahara. Yes, those beetles that roll balls of dung. From the outside, it looks comical, but what they do is comparable in significance to an entire waste processing plant for the ecosystem. When an Addax or a gazelle leaves droppings on the surface, the dung beetle finds it, forms a ball, and rolls it underground into a specially dug chamber. There, it lays eggs, and the larvae feed on the dung. But the side effects of this process are far more important than the beetle's reproduction. First, the dung beetle aerates the soil. Its burrows and tunnels allow air to penetrate layers that would otherwise be completely compacted. Second, it mixes organic matter with mineral soil, creating what can be called the embryo of soil. Third, the dung contains seeds of plants that have passed through the herbivore's intestines. These seeds end up in the underground chamber, in a moist, heat-protected environment, which is ideal for germination. Fungal networks and bacteria further decompose the organic matter, and around the dung beetle's burrow, a thin layer of fertile soil forms in otherwise completely sterile sand. Without dung beetles, the soil of the Sahara would contain absolutely nothing. No organic matter, no trace elements, no conditions for the growth of any plants. And without plants, there would be no roots to hold the surface and prevent the dunes from moving. Without this anchor, the sand would shift, and the desert would expand even faster than it does now. So here you have three levels of one system. At the bottom, the resource collector, the beetle that pulls water literally from the air and feeds the food chain. In the middle, the large nomadic platform, the Addax, which moves organic matter hundreds of kilometers and acts as a transport system for seeds and nutrients. And underground, the processor, the dung beetle, which turns waste into soil and gives seeds a chance to sprout. Remove any of these three levels, and the remaining two will cease to function. They don't just coexist, they're interwoven. This isn't a collection of animals that just happen to be nearby. It's a structure, and in the next part, we'll go beyond the Sahara and see how this structure impacts the other side of the planet, a place that couldn't be more different from the desert, the Amazon rainforest. Up to this point, we've looked at the Sahara from the inside, dissecting how life is structured on its surface and beneath it. Now it's time to pull back to the maximum distance and see the big picture, because the craziest thing about this desert isn't what happens within it, but what it does to the rest of the planet. The Sahara isn't a closed system. It's a hub of global metabolism, and its threads stretch across oceans and continents to places no one would think to connect. To understand this story, we need to start from one specific place, the Beetles Depression. This is a basin in northeastern Chad, wedged between the Tibesti Mountains to the north and the Enedi Mountains to the east. Right now, it's one of the most inhospitable places, even by Sahara standards, flat, scorched, covered with a whitish crust. But 7,000 years ago, there was a lake here, and not just any pond, but one of the largest freshwater bodies that ever existed on Earth. It's called Mega Chad. Its area is about 400,000 square kilometers, comparable to the Caspian Sea. It's the fourth largest lake on the planet. Fish, crocodiles, and hippos lived in it. Giraffes and herds of antelope roamed its shores. People fished and painted hunting scenes on the rocks. It was a different world, green and humid, and now there's nothing left but a dry lake bed and what lies on that bed. And on that bed lie trillions of microscopic shells. Diatoms are single-celled organisms that lived in the waters of Mega Chad for thousands of years and sank to the bottom after they died. Each diatom builds a shell out of silica, a tiny glass house, and when the algae die, the house remains. Over the millennia, a layer of these shells has accumulated on the lake bed, measuring tens of meters thick. Each shell is packed with phosphorus and iron, minerals that the algae accumulated during their lifetime. The lake dried up. The algae have been dead for thousands of years, but their legacy hasn't gone anywhere. It lies on the surface of the Beetles and waits for the wind. And the wind comes. The harmattan is a dry, dusty, harsh wind that blows from the northeast at speeds of up to 100 kilometers per hour. It cuts into the Beetles Depression like an aerodynamic tube as the Tibesti and Enedi mountains compress and accelerate the airflow. This accelerated wind lifts dust from the bottom of the dead lake into the air. Not a handful, not a cloud, 182 million tons a year. That's about 700 train cars every minute, year-round. The Beetles Depression is the most powerful point source of dust on the entire planet. The dust plume rises to heights between 1 and 5 kilometers and begins to move westward. A NASA satellite called Calypso tracks it in real time, and in the images, it looks like a river. A giant yellow-brown river hundreds of kilometers wide flowing through the air across the Sahara, emerging over the Atlantic Ocean and continuing on, over 3,000 kilometers of open water. And while this dust flies over the ocean, it does something along the way. It contains iron, soluble iron that falls into the water and becomes fertilizer for phytoplankton, microscopic algae living in the upper layer of the ocean. Phytoplankton is the foundation of the oceanic food chain and produces a significant portion of the oxygen we breathe. Iron is one of the main limiting factors for its growth in the open ocean. The waters of the Atlantic have enough nitrogen and phosphorus, but they are catastrophically low in iron, and the Saharan dust fills that gap. Dead algae from a dead lake in a dead desert nourish living algae in a living ocean. If someone wrote this in a movie script, they'd be told they were overdoing it. But the end point of the dust plume isn't the ocean. The end point is the Amazon. The Amazon basin is the largest tropical forest on Earth, a place with the highest biodiversity of any existing ecosystem. Every 10th known animal species lives there. The trees stand so closely that sunlight doesn't reach the ground. Rivers carry 1/5 of all the fresh water on the planet. It's a place that seems like the complete opposite of the Sahara: wet, green, overflowing with life down to the last square centimeter. And this place depends on the Sahara so much that without it, it would start to die. In 2015, NASA published a study based on data from the Calypso satellite over several years of observation. The result was this: every year, about 27,700,000 tons of Saharan dust settles over the Amazon basin. Of that amount, about 22,000 tons is pure phosphorus. 22,000 tons of phosphorus is roughly the same amount that is washed out of Amazonian soils by tropical rains each year. Here, it's important to explain why this is so crucial. The soils of the Amazon are very ancient. They have formed over tens of millions of years, and during that time, rains have washed out almost all soluble minerals. Phosphorus is one of the key elements that plants need to grow, and there's almost none left in Amazonian soils. The forest is so vast and so hungry for nutrients that it can't rely on its own soil reserves, and without an external source of replenishment, it would begin to degrade over a few centuries. That external source is dust from the bottom of a lake that dried up 7,000 years ago on another continent. When you realize this connection, the usual worldview cracks a bit. The most lifeless surface on Earth nourishes the most vibrant. The desert keeps the tropical forest on a drip, and neither of them knows it. They just function as parts of one mechanism, separated by 3,000 kilometers of ocean. And if you remove one part, the other will go down. And here arises an uncomfortable thought. From time to time, there are projects to green the Sahara, to plant trees, set up irrigation, turn it into farmland. At first glance, the idea sounds beautiful. Why waste such territory when people need food and space? But if you remove the Sahara as a source of dust, remove that bare, dry, wind-exposed surface, the dust plume will disappear, and with it, the nourishment for phytoplankton in the Atlantic will vanish, and the phosphorus drip for the Amazon will disappear. Trying to fix what isn't broken could trigger a chain reaction whose consequences we can't even fully predict. The Earth isn't a collection of separate zones that can be moved and rearranged individually. It's a system of feedback loops where each element is connected to others. The desert is linked to the forest is linked to the ocean is linked to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is linked back to the desert. The circle closes at every level, and pulling on one thread means pulling on all the others. I think there's something in this story that goes beyond biology and climatology. It's a lesson about how we view the world. We tend to evaluate things by their appearance. Green means alive, yellow means dead, empty means useless. But the planet is structured differently. It's arranged so that the dead lake bed in the heart of Africa quietly, without any fanfare, without a single living cell, supports the most complex forest on the planet. We would walk past the Baudelaire Depression and see only dust and a whitish crust. But that crust is the foundation on which an ecosystem with 10% of all Earth's species stands. Sometimes, the most important things look like nothing at all. In the next part, we'll return to the Sahara and talk about those at the top of the food chain, about predators that work 2 shifts, day and night, and keep the ecosystem from collapsing, about the ghost cheetah, which exists on the brink of extinction, about the scorpion whose venom is studied by oncologists, and about the owl that hears a mouse under the sand by the sound of its heartbeat. We've covered the foundation: beetles, antelope, dung beetles. We've gone global and seen how dust from the Sahara feeds the Amazon. Now we're heading back to the desert, because this system has another layer without which everything will fall apart: predators. And here we need to explain right away why they are needed at all, because at first glance, it seems that in a place where food is already scarce, predators are just extra mouths. But in reality, it's quite the opposite. The problem looks like this: resources in the Sahara are limited, but they exist. Rare shrubs, succulents, clumps of grass after the rains, rodents, insects, and small herbivores compete for these resources. And if their populations go out of control, and without predators, they do so very quickly, they will eat all the vegetation clean. And the roots of that vegetation hold the surface together. Without roots, the topsoil crumbles, the wind picks it up, and the dunes start to move. An area that was at least somewhat alive turns into something completely dead. Predators are needed not to kill, but to prevent herbivores from destroying what little there is. This isn't cruelty, it's regulation. Moreover, it's precise regulation because there's no room for error in the Sahara. The daytime shift, the Saharan cheetah. If you thought cheetahs only live in the savannah, think again. There's a unique subspecies in the Sahara, and it's so rare that most zoologists have never seen one in person. Fewer than 250 individuals inhabit the entire desert, and that's an optimistic estimate. The actual number could be significantly lower. The Saharan cheetah doesn't resemble its savanna relative. Its coat is noticeably paler, with blurred and less contrasting spots. Perfect camouflage for the rocky wastelands of the Ahagar Highlands, where it primarily resides. It has adapted to a mostly crepuscular and nocturnal lifestyle, because hunting during the day in 50-degree heat is a sure way to perish, even for a predator. Its territory is vast, as prey is extremely scarce, requiring it to cover enormous distances to find a Dorcas gazelle or a hare. The population density is one of the lowest among all large cats on the planet. This cheetah lives on the edge of what is biologically possible for a predator of its size, and each unsuccessful hunt brings it closer to starvation. Another detail that speaks volumes about life in the Sahara: the Saharan cheetah, almost never approaches open water sources. It gets its hydration from the blood of its prey. Just think about it. A large cat that drinks blood instead of water because there's no water available. Another daytime regulator is the desert monitor lizard, a large reptile up to 1.5 meters long, powerful and resilient. The monitor controls populations of lizards, small rodents, and raids the nests of ground birds. But it has a second role that isn't directly related to hunting. The monitor digs deep burrows, over 1 meter deep, and uses them as thermal shelters to wait out the peak heat. When it leaves the burrow, other animals take over. Lizards, beetles, small snakes, spiders, dozens of species use monitor burrows as refuges. One predator, by digging itself a shelter, creates infrastructure for an entire community. Now, let's talk about an ambush predator. The carpet viper from the genus Echis is a small snake, up to 60 centimeters long, unremarkable, with a brownish pattern that blends perfectly with sand and gravel. Yet it is responsible for the highest number of snake bites across the African continent, not because it's aggressive, but because it's nearly invisible until you step on it. It lies in wait for rodents and lizards. Its venom destroys the tissues of its victim, allowing it to conserve energy by avoiding pursuit or struggle. It bites, waits, and then eats. Maximum efficiency in conditions where every calorie counts. Alongside it is another ambush hunter, the fat-tailed scorpion Adaptations. Its name translates from Greek as man-killer, and that's no exaggeration. Its venom contains a neurotoxin that blocks sodium channels in nerve cells, causing paralysis. For small animals, it's an instant death sentence. For humans, it poses serious danger without medical assistance. However, in the context of the ecosystem, Adaptations is interesting not for its venom, but for its metabolism. This scorpion can slow its metabolism to such an extent that it can go for months without eating or moving, simply sitting in a crevice between rocks and waiting for prey to come within striking distance. It's a predator that expends less energy to survive than any other creature of comparable size. What's particularly fascinating is that components of Adaptations venom are currently being actively studied by pharmacologists. Individual peptides from its venom show properties that could potentially be used to develop new antibiotics and cancer-fighting drugs. A scorpion from the Sahara, sitting under a rock and waiting for prey, might turn out to be a source of medicine that saves thousands of lives. Now, let's shift to the night shift. When the sun sets and temperatures drop by dozens of degrees, those who spent the day in hiding come out to hunt. The desert owl is a predatory bird with a wingspan of up to 130 centimeters, an absolute ruler of the Sahara's night sky. Its flight is silent, and that's not a metaphor. The edges of its flight feathers are covered with tiny serrations that break up the airflow and dampen turbulence. Any other bird of that size creates a distinctive noise while flying, but the owl moves in complete silence. A rodent sitting on the surface hears nothing until the moment of impact. Even more astonishing is how the owl locates its prey. Its ear openings are positioned asymmetrically on its head, one higher, the other lower. This allows it to perceive sound in three-dimensional space and pinpoint the source of noise with an accuracy of 1 degree. A mouse rustling in the sand in complete darkness, and the owl knows its exact coordinates from just that sound. It doesn't need light. It doesn't need sight. Its hearing works like radar. Another nocturnal hunter, small but fundamentally important, is the desert long-eared hedgehog. This small creature has disproportionately long ears that serve both as locators and radiators for shedding excess heat. The hedgehog hunts insects and scorpions, and here's where it gets interesting. It's partially immune to venom. Not completely, but enough to catch and eat a scorpion without serious consequences. This makes it a unique link in the chain because without hedgehogs, populations of scorpions and nocturnal insects would grow uncontrollably. And unchecked insect growth means the destruction of the night-blooming succulent flowers that are pollinated specifically at night. No hedgehogs, too many insects, no flowers, no seeds, no new plants. The chain collapses within a few generations. Here's how it all works together. During the day, cheetah, monitor, viper, scorpion. At night, owl, hedgehog, and dozens of less noticeable hunters. Two shifts of one conveyor that provide round-the-clock control over populations of rodents and insects. No prey species gets a window in which it can reproduce without limits. 24 hours a day, someone is monitoring the balance. And if any link is removed from this two-shift system, the cascading effect will ripple down the chain. First, an explosive growth of one species, then the destruction of vegetation, followed by soil degradation, and finally, the movement of sands. A desert that was once alive will transition into a state of absolute death. And as we already know from the third part, what happens inside the Sahara doesn't stay inside the Sahara. In the next final part, we'll look back into the deep past, when the Sahara was a green savanna with hippos and crocodiles. We'll discuss how it became a desert, what we're doing to it, and whether we can stop what's already been set in motion. Everything we've covered so far, beetles, antelopes, predators, dust trails across the ocean, this is the Sahara today. But this desert has a past, and it's so different from the present that it sounds like a description of another planet. 8,000 years ago, the Sahara was a green savanna, not isolated oases, not patches of greenery among the sand, a full-fledged savanna with rivers, lakes, forests, herds of animals, and human settlements. This period is called the African Humid period, lasting roughly from the 10th to the 5th millennium before our era. The climate back then was about 10 times wetter than it is now. Monsoons reached much further north, bringing rains deep into areas that now go years without precipitation. The land was crisscrossed by flowing rivers, in the valleys of which acacias and baobabs grew. In the water, bodies lived hippos, crocodiles, and dozens of fish species. On the shores roamed giraffes, elephants, rhinos, and herds of antelope. Humans lived here, fishing, herding cattle, building settlements, and leaving behind evidence that has survived to this day. These remnants are one of the most astonishing places on Earth. Tassili Najer, a plateau in southeastern Algeria, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. On the rocks of this plateau, over 15,000 drawings and engravings dating back up to 12,000 years have been preserved. They depict antelopes, giraffes, crocodiles, herds of cattle, hunting scenes, figures of dancing people, women with children, and warriors with spears. This is a stone chronicle of a world that no longer exists. Standing in front of this rock, you look at the drawing of a giraffe, raise your eyes, and for hundreds of kilometers around, there's not a single tree or blade of grass, just stone and scorching air. The giraffe is painted in a place where it now has nothing to eat and nowhere to hide from the sun. Between this drawing and today's landscape lies a chasm of several thousand years, and this gap formed faster than one might expect. What happened? The Earth's axis slightly changed its tilt. This is a cyclical process that repeats every few tens of thousands of years. The change is small, but it was enough to shift the zone of maximum heating and weaken the monsoons that brought rain to North Africa. Precipitation decreased, and vegetation began to retreat. Then a feedback loop kicked in, and that's what ultimately killed the green Sahara. When plants disappear, the soil is exposed. The bare, light surface reflects sunlight more strongly than greenery does, heating the air above it. The hot air rises, creating a zone of low pressure at the surface, but at the same time, the dry air above descends and suppresses cloud formation. Rainfall decreases even further, more plants die, and even more soil is exposed. This process feeds on itself and accelerates with each cycle. The Green Sahara didn't fade slowly and sadly. It collapsed in just a few centuries, which is a blink of an eye in geological terms. But something of the Green Sahara remains. In the isolated mountain water bodies of the Tibesti and Enedi plateaus, in tiny lakes fed by underground springs, relict populations of fish and crustaceans still live. They've been cut off from the rest of the world for thousands of years, with their closest relatives living thousands of kilometers away in the rivers of West and Central Africa. These fish are living witnesses to the fact that there was once water here. Living proof, stuck in stone puddles in the middle of the desert, like a photograph in a frame on the wall of a burned house. Now, the human factor, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. Over the last 100 years, the Sahara has expanded by more than 10%. It's growing southward, encroaching on a strip of semi-arid land known as the Sahel. And the reason for this growth isn't astronomy or the cycles of the Earth's axis. The reason is us. The Sahel is a transitional zone between the Sahara and the equatorial forests, stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. About 135 million people live here, most of whom depend on the land. They graze livestock, grow millet and sorghum, and cut trees for firewood and construction. The problem is that this land is on the very edge where life is still possible, and any extra pressure tips the balance toward desertification. Overgrazing destroys grass faster than it can recover. Deforestation removes the root systems that hold the soil in place. Without roots, the topsoil crumbles, the wind carries it away, and bare sand is left where pastures once thrived. This process is called desertification, and it's happening right now, every day, while you're watching this video. But there's another side to this story, and it gives grounds for at least some hope, if not optimism. In 2007, the African Union launched a project called the Great Green Wall. The idea is grand: to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land, creating a band of restored vegetation 8,000 kilometers long, from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east, across 11 countries. The project's goals are to absorb 250 million tons of carbon dioxide and create 10 million jobs for local people. And it's important to understand one thing: the Great Green Wall isn't an attempt to destroy the Sahara or plant forests in the desert. We already know from the third part what that would lead to. Without Saharan dust, the Amazon would be left without phosphorus. No, this project is an attempt to restore a buffer zone, to return the Sahel to the state it was in before we started destroying it, so that the desert remains a desert within its natural boundaries, rather than consuming the lands where people live. To date, about 18 to 20 million hectares have been restored, which is roughly 15 to 20% of the goal. The project is struggling. There's a lack of funding. Armed conflicts are ongoing in several countries, and coordinating among 11 governments is a colossal challenge in itself. But the results in individual countries are impressive. In Senegal, restored areas are already yielding crops. In Ethiopia, billions of trees have been planted. In Niger, farmers are using a traditional technique called zai, small pits in the soil that collect rainwater and organic matter, where trees thrive even in dry conditions. These local victories show that the process is reversible. That desertification isn't a death sentence if we act in time and understand how the system works. And now, the finale. I want you to hold the entire chain in your mind because it's worth it. A darkling beetle stands on the crest of a dune, collecting water from the fog with the nanostructure of its shell. An Addax antelope travels hundreds of kilometers without ever approaching a water source, carrying seeds of plants in its intestines that will later end up in the dung ball of a dung beetle and sprout in an underground chamber. A ghost cheetah controls the population of gazelles so they don't eat the last shrubs. An owl silently removes rodents from the surface so they don't eat the roots that hold the soil. A scorpion sits under a rock for months, and its venom could become the basis for a medicine that saves people on another continent. And the dead dust from the bottom of a lake that dried up 7,000 years ago flies across the Atlantic and nourishes the most lush forest on the planet with phosphorus. All of this is one system, not a collection of separate facts for a popular science video, but a functioning structure where each detail supports the next. And when someone next says that the Sahara is an empty place that serves no purpose, you'll know that's not true. That behind this dry, scorching, seemingly lifeless surface lies an engineering marvel that we're just beginning to understand, and that the most lifeless place on Earth turned out to be one of the most necessary. Thank you for sticking with us until the end. If this video changed your worldview by even 1 degree, then it was worth it.